Dear students, welcome to our class, online class again. In the previous session, we talked about realism and security studies. Today, we'll be dealing with liberalism. We'll be talking about liberalism and liberal perspective in relation to security studies in international relations. So, this is to say we are still talking about theoretical approaches and different securities, part 1 in our major textbook. So this is chapter 2. What we're going to talk about today. Well, as we did for the previous session for realism, I think it's better to talk about, first of all, try to define liberalism in relation to international relation theories and then try to adopt it to security studies in general. So let's start with Doyle and his understanding of liberal perspective. According to Doyle, liberalism resembles a family portrait of principles and institutions recognizable by certain characteristics. For example, individual freedom, political participation, private property, and equality of opportunities. And when we take a look at the realm of international relations, we believe that students look to liberalism at most of the time to explain how human reason, progress, individual rights and freedoms can give rise to more peaceful interstate relations. So within this backdrop, within this understanding now, we will try to look at how this type of understanding, this type of perspective can be applied to our understanding of security and security threats within international system. So let's take a look at, to even further elaborate on liberal perspective as a theoretical approach, before we move on with its understanding of security, let's also take a look at the main assumptions of liberal perspective. So within the backdrop that we talked about in the previous slide, we would say that liberals predict that stable democracies and economically interdependent states will behave differently in several respects. This is what makes liberalism an extremely interesting and significant theory for our understanding of security, the understanding that stable democracies and economically interdependent states within the international system would actually behave in different manners in compared to less democracies, less democratic states, or less, if you like, interlinked global economy. So according to these assumptions, first of all, we would say that democratic states are less likely to initiate and escalate conflicts with other states. This is known as democratic peace theory within liberal perspective. And according to that understanding, states within international system, within still anarchic international system, so the nature of the international system is still anarchic, similar to the realist perspective in liberal understanding. But the point is that when states are liberal, they can act in different manners. And this is known to be as more peaceful manners, I would say. So this is known to be as democratic peace theory. And the second assumption about liberal perspective would put forward that democratic states are more likely to engage in international trade and investment, and the resulting interdependence will contribute to peace. So step by step, according to liberal perspective, we would build on our understanding of peaceful international environment within still anarchic context. So once states are democratic, the understanding, the assumption is that they can also build on further, if you like, building upon trade and investment, international trade and investment, so that they can create interdependent state understanding. And the third assumption behind this, if you like, liberal predictions is that democratic states are more likely to see cooperative solutions through international institutions. So according to these three assumptions, we would say that in short, liberal perspective puts forward that states who are more democratic can act in a more peaceful manner because they can engage in more, if you like, interdependent actions together, so they can create global economy, for instance. And within that context, within that perspective, they would more eager to solve their conflicts and tensions between themselves. So this would be also done, I mean, the point is that this cooperative manner can be more possible to achieve within international institutions. So 3 assumptions, therefore, are quite related to each other. And the main assumption behind all these is the fact that democratic states act in different ways within international system. So to sum up what we have said so far about liberal perspective, or the main liberal claim, so to say, would be that democratic institutions, economic interdependence, and international institutions, they facilitate peace. So this point directly links us to our security studies discussion. So here, the understanding that in such an environment, peace can be facilitated in an easier manner forces us to look at further, it motivates us to look at further to different strands of liberal international theory to understand further how this perspective can actually contribute to our understanding of security. So when we take a look at, within that framework, within that perspective, when we take a look at strands of liberal international theory, it's possible to see that we actually have 2 different strands. The evolutionary liberalism of Kant appears to be the first one, and the second one is the revolutionary liberalism of Paine. So, according to the first strand of thought within liberal perspective, which derives from Kantian understanding, it is possible to say that this type of perspective recognizes a combination of shared and competing preferences that makes cooperation and progress far more difficult. Whereas, more of a revolutionary liberalism of Paine puts forward that harmonious preferences facilitate cooperation and progress. So based on these 2 understandings, now we will try to elaborate further about liberal perspective and security studies. So it's possible to say that to best understand how liberalism contributes to security studies, influences security studies, we must turn to state society level, so to say, which examines the impact of governmental structures on society. So the question appears when we take a look at this state society level within the liberal perspective, the main question which follows from that understanding is that why democratic states may behave more peacefully. We said earlier in the previous slides that actually democratic states, one of the main assumptions of liberal perspective is that democratic states, they behave in a more peaceful manner. So the question when we take a look at more society-state level understanding in liberal perspective the main focus appears to be the democratic regimes. So this is why we follow up with the question why democratic states may behave more peacefully in international system. Well, there are different perspectives. We will try to look at 2 main perspectives, one which is deriving from Paine and the other one which is deriving from Kant, actually, to try to find out a plausible basic answer for that question, why democratic states act in a more peaceful manner. So when we take a look at the Paine, he puts forward that peace results from the democratic tendency to negotiate the mistake rather than letting regal, if you like, pride swell into a rupture with foreign powers. So according to Paine, therefore, the main motivation behind democratic states with an international system to act in a more peaceful manner is the fact that they eager more to negotiate their mistakes. So the interaction and this understanding between these states, more democratic states, is much higher according to Paine. And this, of course, naturally contributes to security. And Kant made a related claim based on the main question of why democratic states act in a more peaceful manner. And he puts forward that the consent of citizens is required to decide whether or not war is to be declared. It's very natural that they will have great hesitation in embarking on so dangerous an enterprise. And for this would mean calling down on themselves to all miseries of war, according to Kant. So when we move further from the state society level, we see that it's also possible to see it from a more systemic level, this perspective about liberalism and security studies. So at a more systemic level, we will try to look at what happens at a more systemic level when we attempt to understand and link 2 perspectives. And we see that we can examine how states they actually interact with other states in the global system. So instead of looking at, therefore, at this point, a more state-level understanding and to try to understand the regime type of state and whether it's democratic or not, in a more systemic level, we tend to look at how states interact. And the peaceful effect of trade remains central to the liberal research tradition. So in the previous approach, therefore, in a more state-society level, the main idea was that, okay, all right, regime type, it determines how states will behave. And democratic states, the main assumptions derives from the idea that more democratic states, they act, when we have a more state-society level approach, analysis, they act in a more peaceful manner because either they can basically maintain peace in a further, if you like, in a further understanding because they can interact more and they can understand each other, or they find war less likely, if you like, in such a peaceful environment. When we take a look at, therefore, on the other hand, to the systemic level and try to understand the international arena, international system, it's possible to say that, according to liberal perspective, the main idea behind the understanding that, in fact, interdependent states would act, if you like, in a more peaceful manner. This understanding derives from the fact that when you are involved in trade relations, interdependent trade relations, that means war and conflict is less likely. So this is naturally in a systemic level, systemic analysis in that regard. And Paine explains this as, if you like, he puts forward that, in a widely circulated Rights of Man, he asserted that free trade creates a pacific system operating to cordialize mankind by rendering nations as well as individuals useful to each other. So, if commerce were permitted to act to the universal extent, therefore, it's capable, it would extirpate the system of war. So, therefore, Paine explains that in an environment, in an international system where we have interdependent states, where we have trade relations, it's more likely and probable to see states evolving actually into more cooperative relations. And it's therefore naturally possible to see less and less conflicts and tensions within that framework. And when we continue to take a look at the systemic level and liberal understanding when it comes to explaining systemic level, if you like, relations and peace, it's possible to say that trade not only produces wealth according to that perspective, the systemic level analysis, but also reduces conflict by promoting understanding and unveiling the harmony of interest between all nations. So this harmony of interest and at the same time shared understanding that this is the best for us appears to be the main motivation behind systemic level understanding in liberal tradition, which puts forward that states which are actually involved into trade relations are less likely to get involved into violent conflicts. So while Kant also saw trade leading to peace, his reasoning was somehow distinct from Paine's, of course, as we said, because there are two distinct strands, as we said, one deriving from Paine and one deriving from Kant. So a less utopian and more pragmatic Kant, in compared to Paine, posited that trade may lead to peace because of the vested interest of international financiers and businessmen. So more or less, actually, both philosophers, both political thinkers, they put forward that when states involved into trade, although they have different perspectives from each other, where Kant is more pragmatic than Paine, they both try to put forward, actually, the idea that when states involved into trade relations, they understand themselves more, they understand each other more, they tend to act in a more cooperative manner because they have a vested interest, actually, they invested in that cooperation, so they have a huge interest where a conflict instead of cooperation would actually risk all this investment of international financiers and businessmen, for instance, according to Kant. So Based on all these different perspectives, when it comes to, therefore, this liberal understanding in security studies, it's possible to say that the three most significant claims have become the vertices of the liberal triangle of peace. So it's possible to talk about, therefore, when it comes to liberalism and security studies, to talk about almost a liberal triangle of peace, where, of course, there are three main angles of this perspective, this triangle. Peace triangle, let's call this. The first one is the democracy, the understanding that democracy reduces military conflicts. Second triangle, the second angle of this peace triangle is that, according to liberal perspective, is that economic interdependence reduces military conflict. And the third one puts forward that international institutions, it reduces military conflict. So while therefore trying to understand how liberalism approaches security studies, I definitely suggest you to focus on this, if you like, liberal triangle of peace to understand the main angles of this argument, the main angles of this, if you like, assumption behind liberal perspective in security studies. So if I need to repeat it once more, so since it's quite important for us for this chapter, democracy reduces military conflict, economic interdependence is extremely important, and international institutions. So, to conclude that part, this chapter about liberalism and security studies, we would say that three pillars of the liberal peace are interwoven together. With three pillars, we're actually referring to three angles of this triangle, liberal triangle of peace. And Kant himself argued that only the combination of the three pillars acting in unison could provide a stable peace in long term. So, as we said earlier, realist perspective sees the world in a more conflictual manner, and therefore they believe that anarchy, as long as it exists, anarchy in international system, it's not possible to cooperate. It's always, although there are some islands of cooperation, we can never trust each other. We would always see actors trying to build up their capacities because they see each other as a threat. And even, our perspective, our endeavor as states to increase our security would lead to further insecurities, because when we try to look at security from a realist perspective, we see that it's more or less all the time related with military capabilities, material capabilities. So when we try to increase our, therefore, material capabilities to feel more secure in an anarchic environment, this would result in further insecurities for others and further build-up of military and material capabilities with an international anarchic environment. So this would create further and further reasons, if you like, pretexts for war and conflict. But when it comes to liberalism, the understanding is that, all right, it's still anarchic environment, we are still living in an anarchic environment. Nevertheless, actually cooperation is more likely even within the anarchic environment, because we have other actors also involved into our understanding, into our analysis, and we have basically regime types which are more keen for democratic, if you like, as democratic states, which are more keen for cooperation, more enthusiastic for cooperation. We have global trade understanding where interests are interlinked, extremely interlinked to each other. So it's impossible to see, therefore, interest of one state distinct from another state's interests. So when interests are, if you like, overlapped, when we have these interwoven interests, interlinked interests, it's possible, according to liberal perspective, to overcome some of the negative consequences of anarchy, but never possible to overcome anarchy at all. Therefore, liberal perspective is still a mainstream approach. It believes that anarchy cannot be overcome, but islands of cooperation can be created by having more democratic states, by having trade, if you like, and by having international institutions, further and further international, if you like, understanding of international institutions, more developed, more large and more integrated, therefore, international system would end up with more secure environment and more peaceful, if you like, environment according to liberal perspective. So these are more or less the points which they differ from realist perspective, and it's always helpful to compare them. It's always helpful to compare realism and liberalism within that tradition. So in this part, we talked about liberal understanding, as I said. So in the next session, we will continue to talk about English school, and English school, if you like, contribution to our understanding of security. And then critical security studies will follow English school perspective. Thank you for joining us today in this session. I would love to have you to read actually the related chapters, chapter 1 and chapter 2, so that you can form solid grounds for our further discussions about security, international politics and security in this session. Thank you very much for joining us.